chat with you about a couple common problems that I've seen organizations run into when they're trying to do this idea of uprooting what the traditional infrastructure is from on-prem into the cloud, and just some of the security challenges that they faced during that migration. But before we get too far into it, I just want to talk a little bit about who I am. So I've been at Tripwire for about 7 years now. I'm a senior systems engineer, and today I support the North American channel, but I've been in a variety of different roles throughout my tenure at Tripwire that has covered environments from your IT side of things moving into your OT side. And usually Tripwire, when someone thinks about or hears the name, is file integrity monitoring. But really that's what the basis of where Tripwire started, and we've really expanded out to there to a variety of different solutions. And so during my time, I've spoke with organizations for a variety of different means, such as compliance for things like PCI, a NERC, a HIPAA, or more certifications like your SOC 2 or your high trust. And then also just a better security practices, again, in these IT and OT environments like manufacturing. And I've worked with various different sizes, including your very small businesses up to your large enterprise companies. Now, I'm based out of Portland, Oregon, and the way that I always describe Portland is that if you like beer with an average of 9 breweries per 50,000 people, or outdoor activities such as like hiking, then it should be high on your destination list. And it sounds like based upon this conversation today, I should also add food to that list as well, because Portland does have a lot of great food. For example, there is a food truck that has gourmet peanut butter and jelly sandwiches. Just think about that for a little bit.
Wow.
And so I also don't really recommend combining this plethora of beer and those outdoor activities, because this is an example of one of the hikes in the Portland area that's called Ruckle Ridge. And you get to the part where it basically has drop-offs on both left and the right side, so that liquid courage may not really help you traverse this particular hike. So now if we go ahead and jump into securing workloads in a hybrid and a multi-cloud environment. Now, that is a fairly buzzword bingo type of a title, which I just need to figure out how to throw in next gen in there and I'll cover all bases. So really, the point of it is, what does it really mean to be secure, especially when we're talking about this new or newer cloud-based infrastructure? Now, if you ask 10 different people what it means to be secure, you're going to ultimately end up with 12 and a half different answers. Because the nebulous nature of being secure, we're not really going to talk about specifics of, hey, what is your deployment look like? What does secure mean for your deployment? But more of what is a strategy that you can take to help make sure that as you're migrating to the cloud, then you keep a solid security foundation that will make sure to cover your on-premises, your cloud, or even cloud assets within multiple environments. And there's a couple critical parts of any security program which does apply to your on-premises all the way up to the cloud. But when I'm talking with these clients, a lot of times these security foundations tend to be more focused on your internal assets, where they may have like a AWS or Azure instance that sits off in some enclave that isn't part of that base security program. Now, I recently had an opportunity to listen to one of Alan Stein Jr.'s speeches, and his main message was around back to the basics. So he was a coach that would spend time with some of the best basketball players out there, and they would spend hours and hours practicing the most mundane and easy maneuvers. But that is ultimately why they end up being the best, because of that solid foundation of being able to master those basics allowed them to then take control of the game and advance from there. So I've always had a philosophy that there's really certain foundations a security program should start with and build your way up from there. So that message really resonated with me. And so one thing that we want to make sure of is, well, let's focus on the basics first. When we're talking security, there could be a wide umbrella of what that means, but really we should be focusing in what are the most critical parts of a security program. Are we excelling at those? Are we mastering those? And then expand out from there. But ultimately, what those basics are going to be relative to a particular organization, because everyone's going to have different needs. So it could be relative to, say, a particular cloud strategy. Like, we are moving everything to the cloud. We're not leaving anything on-prem. And that's a important note to know of what it would look like to ultimately secure those assets. But what I've found is that most organizations that I speak to are going to be more of this hybrid environment. So they're not going to take absolutely everything and put it into the cloud. They'll have some critical assets. Maybe they're financial related that they won't want to have in AWS. Maybe they're security tools that you're not going to want in the cloud. So there's going to be this idea of being able to make sure that you have coverage for whether it exists in some data center within a private cloud, or maybe just back in the corporate network, or within AWS and Azure. And now, for example, about the relativity of the different basics is, I've spoken with a lot of NERC clients. Now, NERC is a very strict regulation, and it actually is one of the few ones that I would say ends up being more secure than a general security framework, because you have to do things like whitelist every service, every installed software, every ports, every user that's on all in-scope systems. So what the basics would be for NERC is completely different than maybe something like PCI, where PCI has your 11.5 integrity monitoring controls, as your 10.5 logging, or your 11.2 for vulnerability scans. And that's going to be a common thing that you see in a lot of these frameworks, because when we also talk about, say, NIST, so someone that needs to be able to adhere for, say, a government contract for NIST, you have your like SI, your system integrity controls, you have your RA, your risk assessment controls, or your AU, which is like audit evidence collection controls. So very similar, but depending on what a organization is ultimately doing is where it will steer your direction to one of these frameworks. Where manufacturing may be looking at IEC 62443, which includes things like network segmentation. So when we're talking about a IP connected factory building something, you really don't want to have a flat network that anyone can go communicate to the robotic arms that's actually doing the work. So in that situation, one of the basics would be, hey, let's make sure that our networks are segmented, so that way we don't have people just communicating from our IT assets all the way down into our manufacturing plant. But when there isn't anything forcing something like PCI or NERC, it's actually fairly surprising how often I've talked to organizations that don't have any sort of framework to guide them. So they're looking at investments, but when you don't have anything to guide you, it tends to be difficult to figure out, well, where do I start? Where do I go? What is going to help me the most at this point in time? So really, if you're not aligned with anything, the first step is just pick a framework to help guide you. So that way you have a framework that has proven value out in the industry, that you know that if we follow this, we know that we will get a return on our investment. And so there's a lot of general security frameworks out there. So you have your NIST, you have your ISO 27001, you have your COBIT. But personally, I prefer the CIS Top 20. And the reason why I prefer the CIS Top 20 is it's very similar to a lot of the regulations out there, like PCI, but they all tend to have very similar requirements, like your vulnerability scans. And so the CIS Top 20 is no exception. It's going to have those requirements. But the reason why I like it is because it's a very succinct list of controls that if you're not sure where to start, it's like, hey, here's your first control, here's your basic number one. You need to inventory all your hardware assets, because if you don't know what's out on the network, it's going to be hard to secure. Two, you need to know what software is running on those assets, because again, if you don't know what software is within the environment, then how do you know that, hey, we need to go protect these databases that we have over here? And then once you have an understanding of all the assets within the environment, that's where vulnerability management comes in. Because according to Gartner research, exploits through vulnerabilities on unpatched systems is still the #1 reason of where data breaches come from. And so that's why these three tend to be the most critical controls from the CIS Top 20. And so I also like to describe the hardening framework as a byproduct of security is going to be compliance. Because you can follow something like PCI and then have a stamp that says, hey, we are PCI compliant, but that is not going to mean that you have a good, solid security program, because PCI, for example, would only mandate vulnerability scans. You have to pass one vulnerability scan, external scan on a quarterly basis. So I'm sure that within that quarter, there's not going to be any bad actors that are going to be trying to exploit any web servers that are available. So that is why, even if you do have something like PCI, it's a starting point, but it does not translate directly into a strong security foundation. And then once we have a vulnerability management in play, the next one is going to be a controlled use of admin privileges. This is basically a PAM solution. So that way you know that, hey, what are the admin what are the admin actions that are happening in my environment? Can I track that? Do I have anything to help control who has access to those admin functions? And then the fifth is going to be secure configurations. And this is where it's going to be making sure that whatever you do have deployed, it is set up in a secure state, and you have confidence that it is in that secure state. And then ultimately, you want to make sure that you're collecting all the logs in a centralized location so you can keep track of what's happening across the environment as needed. So the CIS controls say that those top 6 controls will provide the most return on your investment if you're not currently doing any of these controls. And so with conversations through organizations, I found that when I talked to them about the CIS controls, they have something targeting, well, we're going to worry about our malware defenses or do a penetration test, which is actually 20. Not to say that it doesn't have value, but if you're not doing things like your asset discovery, then that's where you're going to want to start. And ultimately, you may end up have a finding from the penetration test of, hey, you should probably end up doing these controls anyway. And the reason why the CIS control is so valuable to me is that there's a lot of information out there in the industry of proven metrics of why it works. So for example, the US CERT director has made a comment about if those basic controls were implemented and monitored on a regular basis, it would prevent about 80 to 85% of the incidences that they respond to. So that is the return on investment. So and if you don't have any of those controls in place, this is where, well, let's make an investment and we'll be able to get our return based upon that particular investment. And these controls are just as important from the on-prem to the cloud. So sometimes when I'm talking with organizations, again, they have this whole security layout, but it's focused on the on-prem asset, and they don't cover the cloud-based AWS over here, or maybe the Azure or the Google Cloud. So these controls are just as valid and need to be implemented within a cloud environment as well. Now, talking a little bit about cloud security. So one question is, who's responsible for the security? Now, there is the shared security model, but the answer to this question, or the perception of the answer to this question, has surprised me a couple of times. So if we take a look at, say, AWS breach, well, Amazon is pretty fast to say that, well, we are not responsible for how the configuration happens on AWS. Now that may seem like a common sense sort of thing from the security perspective that, yeah, we're basically just renting infrastructure. We need to make sure that we are securing the configuration. But there is this perception out there that just because it's in the cloud, that means it's secure. And when I said that you get 12.5 answers back from what being secure means, the half answer is that it's in the cloud, it's already secure. So I've recently spoke to a CISO at one of my companies that offers hosting services, and one of their clients got infected with ransomware. Now, the first thing they did was blame the hosting company for not preventing it. It was in the cloud, so I thought you were going to be able to prevent this sort of stuff within my assets. And so I'll also let you guess if that particular client bought any of the offered security services with the hosting. So again, that may be considered a common sense, but there is that perception out there, and it could lead to results. Now, although the cloud environment implementation may look different than the on-premises counterparts, these same basic controls, like making sure it's in a secure configuration, are still critical, because we all know that there's never any issues with public assets or storage like S3 buckets being publicly available, except for all of these examples. So I'm not going to step through each and every one of these, but these are just some more recent examples that have happened for public buckets being left with customer data on it that someone can just go crawl and pull down. And so this is a lot of data that's out there. And the crazy part to me is that the S3 buckets are private by default. So each one of these breaches means that there was an intentional choice that was made to set the bucket into that public state. Now, I do want to point out number 10, because that one is more than just data being exposed on a bucket. A Magecart is a group that scans for unsecured buckets, and then they look for JavaScript files. Then it adds a credit card skimming code to those files and actually then re-uploads the JavaScript file. So really, if someone is using, say, AWS to store a JavaScript file that processes credit card data, what then this does is that without realizing it, it just adds in that malicious code. And this malicious code has affected over 17,000 domains. And so that is one of the key areas where the risk is involved when you have this unsecure bucket. It's not just about losing data. And a recent scan of over 100,000 S3 buckets showed that currently about 10% of them are public. Now, it being public isn't necessarily a bad thing, but then out of those buckets that are set to public, about 20% of them are writable. Now, that is where the risk comes into play, because out of those public writable buckets, that's where you can pull down files and just overwrite them without anyone realizing it if there's nothing actually looking at what's happening within these buckets. But it's more than just buckets as well that we're seeing having issues with misconfigurations. So Elasticsearch has also been making its name in the news recently because of people not securing it and having unauthenticated databases that are publicly exposed online. So one of the bigger ones is the 1.2 billion personal records that was exposed through the People Data Labs. But then, as we can see here, there's been a few other big breaches that are all just from a misconfiguration of not locking down this particular database. Apparently, really just the whole cloud strategy just needs to be securing S3 buckets and Elasticsearch, and apparently most of the data leaks will go away. But what is the cause of these simple misconfiguration? So within 2019, Tripwire has done a few surveys asking around this idea of, hey, how's it going bringing in security professionals with the necessary security skills to secure the environment? So 80% of professionals found that in 2019, it was harder to find people with the necessary skills, while at the same time, 68% have said that the skill shortages were impacting their security operations. And so that is one reason why these insecure configurations we see happening, is that potentially we're just not seeing the people needed in the positions to be able to make sure that, hey, are S3 buckets covered within our security? Are we making sure that we don't have any publicly open databases like an Elasticsearch? But then what this also has resulted in is 53% have said that it's given them an insecure configuration like a public S3 bucket. But then on the flip side of this, 73% of organizations still also configure application security policies manually. So in the world of public infrastructure, moving things into the cloud, everything is moving faster than it's been ever before, including things like DevOps, of being able to push changes out to production. This idea of security policies manually just was kind of baffling to me, because this is going to be one of the key areas that you want to be able to have validation that, yes, this is secure, we can prove it, and here's how we have something that's checking these configurations. And so you really want to take a trust but verify approach, because you need to be able to understand if you're set up in a secure state. So Light in the Box recently had a unsecured database with 1.6 billion records, for example, that could have been solved if they had something that was looking at their configurations for critical aspects like the database that's holding their customer records. Or if we take a look at the Capital One breach, this actually involved a couple misconfigurations. The first was there was a firewall mod security that was just letting too much traffic through. And then the role of the firewall also had access to S3 buckets, which it really shouldn't have. Now, in most cases, that would probably be fine. But then what happened here, why that combination became a problem, was because the traffic that it allowed through the firewall was able to, an attacker was able to send a forged request to the AWS metadata service. And that service is all about returning a temp credentials that matches the role to be able to then access resources within AWS. So basically this forged request was able to give an attacker the same credential set as that firewall, which then had access to S3 buckets, which then allowed that data to be exfiltrated. So again, if they had something looking at the configurations to understand that it was set up that way, then they would be able to validate that, yes, we know that what we're storing in the cloud is in a secured state. But then the right tools isn't the only problem I've seen with various organizations. So now at a RSA, one of the chief security officers of the public cloud at Palo Alto commented on the tools that organizations are using from small size to 50 to 20 to about 50 to 60 in the medium to over 130 in an enterprise account. Now, some of my experiences were around the 15 to 20 area, but I realized that I was asking for specific tools when I got that answer. So when I started to ask more broad questions about, hey, just what tools do you have to interact on a daily basis, I also started to get the same answers as I'm seeing here, where a lot of my medium-sized clients are using 50 to 60, even one mentioned that I think they had like 67, I think is the number that they came back with. And that's a lot of tool sets. And so how do you really become confident in using your security tools if you have to master something like 50 different tool sets, how they work, what data that they collect? And so one security team I spoke with had to actually rotate tool ownership every few months because it was too much for a single person to become proficient in. And a different organization, they actually did kind of a hat draw for who got what. So they'd put all of their applications into basically a pool, and then they just draw it randomly, and then that's what the person was going to focus on for the next couple months. But then when we bring in cloud providers, this only becomes worse, because now you may have tools that were for traditionally on-prem, but now they don't work in AWS. And then AWS has 30 security services available alone specific to AWS. So I've also ended up talking with organizations that have a tool that does the same thing for AWS, a tool that does the same thing for Azure, and then the tool for their on-prem assets. So again, that ends up being 3 tools that you need to be proficient in to do the same data set. So another thing that has a lot of value when you're looking at moving some of your assets or expanding into the cloud is just do a tool audit of what's being used today. Make sure that you're not using multiple tools for the same thing, or make sure that they work across the entire infrastructure. Because if you have a tool set that forces you to buy something specific for cloud providers just because it doesn't support it, then maybe you'll want to look into a single tool that can cover all the assets from, well, what does the beginning of our migration look like? So we need to make sure it can cover these on-prem assets, to, well, during the migration, we needed to be able to cover our on-prem and the cloud. And then if the end result ends up being more cloud focused, well, we need to make sure that it can then handle how we're now doing business at the end of that migration. And so a couple tool consolidation recommendations is that I mentioned pointing to a framework as far as help guiding a security program. So what that can then do is also help find what tools will adhere to that framework, and then it can help you find an overlap. So I've talked with clients that would actually put all their tool sets in a Excel spreadsheet, put in what it does, what functionality it has, and then use that to compare them to find this overlap. Because if you can reduce the tool set, then now you can focus more on the data from those particular tools, get more proficient in it, and then just make sure that you're not letting anything slip through the cracks because, oh, I forgot to log into tool 49 today when I got the other 48 beforehand. But then it also needs to support the full infrastructure. So what all assets do you have? Do you have some esoteric assets like AIX, Solaris? Are you going to need to go get specific tools to cover those? Well, then now we need something that will then cover the cloud-based things. So you just want to make sure that, do you have the support that you need to cover all your platforms for the same functionality in the same tools, so you don't have to go and buy point solutions to make up for the lack of support for either a platform or a configuration. But then the whole life cycle of the company strategy is important too. So this is the idea of, well, no matter where you are in that migration, whether you're at the beginning, in the middle, or the end, you just need to make sure that the tools that you're using do support that, because I've chatted with some organizations that during this migration, they just picked up, moved a bunch of stuff to AWS, and then realized that they were missing a lot of controls there that they did have on-prem, and they then couldn't use it, so they then had to scramble to figure out, well, how do I make up for this? We need to go find something. And then the data flow is also important. How are your tools going to be used? Are you going to send the data primarily into a SIEM or our SOC to look at it? Or are we sending it over to a SOAR? And understanding how the data will be used will then make sure that you're looking at the tools in the right light to make sure that it will ultimately be able to handle what you need. Now, before I start to jump into some DevOps related workflows here, are there any questions on anything I've touched based on, or any experiences that you guys have seen that either mirrored or maybe is a different experience than what I've chatted through today?
Well, I do have one question, and sorry I didn't jump in sooner, but that you are referencing the skills gap. What is that? Where are the test results from? What's your reference for that?
Yeah, so the skills gap specifically will be from a survey that Tripwire conducted, and within the PowerPoint deck, it will have all the sources of where I get this from as well, so you can see what it's based off of. Okay,
wow, awesome, thank you.
Yeah, any other questions here before we talk a little bit about DevOps?
Yeah, go ahead.
I just have a comment. When you're talking about the tools, these vendors change their tools so fast. Like if you look at AWS, for example, what they have today is really different from what they had even a month ago. Mm-hmm. And so it's really hard to keep up with the pace of innovation that the cloud service providers are doing. And I think that creates a bit of a problem for people going to the cloud as well.
No, absolutely. And then there's this also an issue where, well, one team uses this tool over here, another team uses this one for the same thing, and there's just overlap because the two teams didn't really communicate, and then now they're paying for overlapping tool sets because of that as well. And that is also a great reason to think about this whole life cycle, because if you're having to change your tool set because the tool sets in AWS keep changing on a consistent basis, is there something maybe outside of AWS that will cover everything that won't necessarily keep changing like that, but then covers what you need? And then sometimes there's like a new need as it pops up, and then, hey, AWS service will excel, so I'm going to go ahead and grab that. But most of the time I found that the functionality needed from these tools isn't really specific, in that there's a lot of options out there that may be able to cover more than just AWS.
Thank you. And there's another comment, then a question from Mike. He says, it seems that part of the issue may be lack of standards in the cloud. Have we taken ourselves back to the time where manufacturers worked to create lockout specifications that require you to use their stuff and nothing else? What happened to common protocols and taxonomy?
Yeah, it's a very interesting topic. And then especially since, so your standard protocols, when you start to also get into this kind of OT environment, those standard protocols then end up just going out the window as well, because there's like 200 different more of operational technology type protocols that are proprietary, and then the unfortunate side is they weren't really built with security in mind either. So that is one of the challenges more on that side, definitely.
I don't have any more questions in the chat.
Brooke, so let's talk a little bit about DevOps security, or DevSecOps, SecDevOps, DevOpsSec, whatever you want to call it. As long as Sec is in there somewhere, that's the key. We need to get some security into this DevOps process. Now, what I found is the DevOps term is used very broadly as well. So I've spoken to a couple clients like this where they're like, yeah, oh yeah, we're using a DevOps process. So I asked a little bit about, well, how are you using your DevOps tools? What's your CDCI pipeline look like? Your continuous development, continuous integration tools? Like, well, first code changes are implemented in dev, and then they're moved to staging, which mirrors prod, and then ultimately then deployed to production. And so that is suspiciously like a normal development process, but they're using the term DevOps. And so that does happen on occasion. So the term of DevOps to me is leveraging automation to increase product release velocity. And so DevOps doesn't necessarily have to strictly be in the cloud or container-based. Those are just the technologies that tend to adhere or allow people to increase this product velocity at a greater speed. And this is an example of a basic DevOps process here, and it's also an example of why I'm not in marketing with my very fancy looking slide here. So this is just going to be a very rudimentary example of what it could look like to do a DevOps deployment. So first, you'll take a image out of the image registry. The developer will then put the code in on this image, which then, once it's ready, it will be pushed to the registry, which then gets orchestrated out to production, which may be a host running in AWS. And so some of the times when I'm talking about security, especially when it's something like DevOps, where the idea is to push out releases as quick as possible, which is actually what I find to be analogous to brakes on a car. And so security, when people think of security, they may think of, hey, it may slow it down. Like I just want to get stuff out there quicker. I don't want security slowing my development process down. Well, brakes on the car were invented not necessarily to slow down the car, but it was to enable the car to go faster. Because if you didn't have brakes, I know I would not be comfortable going more than 10, 15 miles per hour in a car. But then you throw brakes on there to where you can slow down as needed. It's like, oh, I'm going 15 to 35. I should probably use those brakes. So the idea to me of building security into a DevOps process is allowing you to actually increase that product velocity, while if there is a security issue, being able to slow down as needed to say that, hey, we found an issue, let's fix it before we go ahead and then continue this push out to production. So what that could look like is, and as the code is checked in, you can build in an automated way that before it's pushed out, well, let's have a check that one, assess the image. Hey, is this set up the way that we would expect? Is there vulnerabilities on this image, or whatever you want to check to make sure that it's safe to go out to production? And then if something happens, let's go ahead and hit the brakes, we'll stop, and then we can fix it so that way you alleviate any issues before it actually hits the production where it's live and then publicly exposed. And so another part of the securing the CDCI pipeline, again, this is going to be a tool set of continuous development and integration tools. And these tools have a lot of privileged access to an environment. So it's not just about the image that's being created, but it's also going to be about the ability to make sure the tools aren't being exploited, because you can have something like Puppet or Chef that has privileged access that's actually making changes on systems. So then if someone, say, put in part of the build script to, say, install SSH library onto something, then maybe that's some remote access that is now available that wasn't really expected because someone just added to the build script. So making sure that you have something watching what these tools are doing is also important, because making sure that, say, Kubernetes is configured securely so you don't have an issue where you have like a unauthenticated Kubernetes pod like Tesla did a couple years ago, where someone was able to get in their Kubernetes and actually then, or excuse me, it was Uber, someone found a open Kubernetes pod that allowed them to then do crypto mining on the dime of the company in that cloud environment. So again, just make sure that you have something that has access to make these changes in your environment, make sure that there's something covering it, so your tool sets that are supposed to help you be more productive don't end up being the cause of the breach. Now, at a high level, this is just a Tripwire at a glance of where we fit in to the picture. So we have a IT and OT tool set available. And so where we see in the blue is going to be what we call the security configuration management. So that's going to be the fifth bucket on the CIS top 20. We also have a vulnerability management and asset discovery. Also have a logging tool as well. But then on the OT side of things, we also have some passive network monitoring that's focused on those OT side protocols. So being able to do deep packet inspection on like your Modbus, your Profinet, Profibus type of protocols. So this is where a Tripwire fits in the picture as a whole here. And if anyone wants to have any specific conversations around, well, where would Tripwire fit in specifically here, or even just get more down into the nitty gritty of what your security program looks like, then don't hesitate to let me know. We can definitely have a conversation around it. But really, that's what I wanted to chat with you guys here today. And I wanted to leave a little bit of time to make sure that there wasn't any topics of conversation that you guys wanted to have while I was on the call here today. And then again, I'll get this PowerPoint deck over to you after the presentation. So anything that I reference here, I know everyone will remember each and every word that I said, but just in case, you can have that reference to point back to, and also to have the sources for some of these breaches and the survey results.
Any
All I can
questions?
say is you've come a long way since I first met Tripwire back when it was open source.
We had our roots in open source. That our founder Gene Kim at Purdue created that as his last project for his degree, and so that kind of spiraled into what Tripwire has become today. Well, a lot of times, because our source is in that open roots FIM, is we get locked into what I call FIM jail that we're trying to break out of, because that's the first thing people think of when they think of Tripwire. To your point, is FIM.
Yeah, but your moment of fame was when you made the PCI DSS standards.
And a fun fact on that, if you're ever doing like bar trivia and Tripwire comes up with PCI, is that, to your point, the first iteration of PCI said that you needed a Tripwire-like tool. Unfortunately, that was removed from the PCI document as time went on, but you're right, we were explicitly mentioned in that first iteration.
Any other questions? Don't be shy, it's all family here.
Awfully quiet tonight.
I know, I think it's Thursday. I think working from home is wearing everybody down. We're too efficient when we don't have the distractions of the of the office. Well, Thomas, I want to thank you so much for giving us this presentation and all your information, and the information about even just the lack in the security skills gap, you know, and that attributing to security issues. And if anybody does have any questions afterwards, I do know how to get in touch with these guys. We can send questions over to them. And like I said, we will share this. We've been recording this. It'll be shared on LinkedIn. We'll share the and other social media We'll share the slides as well. And I did promise to share the link for the conference. This link is for sponsorship registration. We don't have the link for folks to sign up and be attendees, but the nice thing about the Security Summit with the Triad ISSA is that there's no cost. So when you register, you can register for free for any of the workshop days or any of the keynote speakers, the security professionals that'll be speaking, and the vendor breakout sessions. So all of that will be free. We'll have an Eventbrite set up soon and posted on LinkedIn for you guys to see, and on our website, which is Triad.NC ISSA.org. So thank you, everybody. Have a great night, and thank you again, Tripwire. We really enjoyed that.
It was my pleasure.
All right, take care. Have a good night.
This is great. Thank you.
Have a good night, everyone.
Good night.
Thanks,
Take
everybody.
care.
Good night. Thank you.